So, Juan, what do you make of it? Is an election the way out of this? You just heard the president say that if you want an election, you'll have an election.
Well, I mean, what's unfortunate is that the Eva Golinger and your other guests that are saying that they're mercenaries and there's a coup attempt, it's unfortunate because we really should be having a real conversation about the facts on the ground. And the reality is the call for a constituent assembly, the allegations of a coup or mercenaries in the country are really just distracting from what has happened since even before Maduro came into power, which is mismanagement of the state, concentration of power, elimination of fundamental freedoms. And what you have right now is a crisis of their own making where people can't get medicine, people cannot get food, the security situation is deteriorating. And now the conversation about the opposition not wanting to engage in dialogue does not include the fact that the opposition has actually tried to engage in dialogue since 2013 with the Maduro government, and they've used it as a delay tactic, including in the discussions about the recall referendum. The dialogue has not really been a real dialogue about the future of the country, about how both sides can work together to make some of the very difficult economic decisions that need to take place.
So tell us about those decisions. What needs to be done? Sure.
Well, I think there are a couple things, and this is actually when I worked for Vice President Biden. We traveled to Brazil, and the Vice President met with President Maduro and said three things. He said, number one, please release the political prisoners. There are people that haven't been charged. Leopoldo Lopez has been sentenced, but there hasn't been any sort of credible proof against him other than he used subliminal messages to stir discord. The second thing he said, look, engage in real dialogue. Sit down and actually try to find common ground with the opposition. And the third thing was there are economic decisions that are difficult where parts of the opposition are going to want to work with you in favor of actually doing the right thing for the country. What that means is getting your economic house in order. Maybe there's a way for them to actually devaluate the currency. There are certain steps that they could take that would actually maybe welcome the international community, the international financial community, to lend to Venezuela again. But now Venezuela is in a situation where there are two kind of pillars that have held Chavismo up since Chavez came to power. Those are electoral legitimacy and the ability to pay their international obligations. Both of those are at risk, primarily the electoral one because Chavez is now, or the Chavistas and the Maduro government are afraid of actually letting the people express the decision about what the future of their country is. If an election was held today, Maduro would lose.
Okay, let me go back to Maria on what we've been hearing. And Maria, notwithstanding the fact on who may be behind these demonstrations or protests, I mean, do you accept that ordinary Venezuelans are suffering quite a bit right now? There are shortages of food, there are shortages of medicine, that people are not really getting what they want.
Oh, absolutely, because the pawns in this war that has been unleashed against Venezuela are my people, the people of Venezuela. And the ambition and the desire of forces that want to control the petroleum and the gas and the fresh water and the gold and the coltan that Venezuela has. This is all about that. Who controls the immense treasure of Venezuela? If Venezuela didn't have these immense riches, I don't think that we would be seeing what is happening now. And what is happening is that, yes, it is my people who are suffering, and that the people who ambitiously want this power do not care how much they are suffering. And I want to say something that is really important, and that is that you should not look at this as an economic problem. This isn't a question of the market and the forces and this or the other. What has happened is that the weakest part of the government, both of Chavez and of Maduro, their weak area was the economy. Because what they were doing is establishing a model based on social justice and equality, and they have spent about 67% of the GDP on misiones. These are to combat poverty, which they have reduced from 80 to 20, extreme poverty reduced to about 5%, free education and health. All of these things cost money. But what they didn't look at was the economic model. So that was the Achilles heel of the economy.
All right, let me get back to Dany. Dany, what do you make of what you've just heard?
Well, I mean, this is, again, more propaganda that comes from the government that just wants to create fear. So I want to ask Maria, like, what about the hundreds, thousands of people who are on the streets every day? What about, I'll let you talk. I would appreciate if you let me talk too.
But I don't belong
There are hundreds of thousands of people. There are hundreds of thousands of people on the streets today. They're getting repressed. There are almost 40 people who have died. They are political prisoners every day. Now, by the way, now there are military tribunals judging people on the spot, civilians, and taking them to jail because they're protesting without weapons. So who has the weapons? Who's the one repressing? Who's the one that is launching tear gas that, by the way, is expired in most cases, and it's almost like a chemical weapon. So, you know, this idea of like these people have been almost 20 years in power, so they're still blaming the imperialism and some other countries. They want to take the reasons. You know, you had for 20 years the opportunity to make this country something, a growing and a good economy, a good place to live. This government had the longest and highest oil boom in the history of Venezuela. Now, not only the price of oil went down, which is, of course, not the government's fault, but the production of oil went down from 3 million barrels a day to 2 million barrels a day. So this is a crisis, the economic crisis. It's not that some people cannot get food. This is a humanitarian crisis.
Okay.
Most Venezuelans, from the government or the opposition, are hungry. They don't have access to basic goods, to medicine. This is not just a little problem because no government is perfect. This is not about this government not being perfect. This is about a government that has mismanaged the resources, that has erased the independence of power, that is a dictatorship, that is repressing its own people on the streets, that is having political prisoners. And I just can't understand how the people some of the people I'm sharing the panel with, they just put a blind eye to it.
Okay, let me go to Eva. Eva, go ahead.
Well, just picking up on all of that initially, just to illustrate, I mean, this is the difficulty Venezuela is facing when you have such extremist opposing views that are unwilling to hear each other out. And I mean, to write off either viewpoint as being either propaganda from either side, or even, I mean, at this stage, no matter how you may feel about the government of Venezuela, it is not a dictatorship. To continuously use that type of language negates what a democracy is, and the viewpoint of others, such as interrupting at this stage. But just to get back to what the previous person who just spoke before me was saying, actually when Maduro was elected and won by an extremely slim margin, the opposition did not openly want to engage in any kind of dialogue to resolve what the country was now facing after Chavez's abrupt death and an economic crisis on the horizon. Instead, what they did was take to the streets with these similar types of violent protests, and several people died in the aftermath of that election in 2013. Maduro then sat down at the end of that year, in December of 2013, to dialogue with leaders of the opposition and to open that process. I'm not saying that his position was the right or the perfect position. What I'm saying is that the disposition of dialogue was there. And then what did the opposition do? The extremist elements, which are the ones we see leading these violent protests in the streets that would not be in any way tolerated in this country, in the United States, whatsoever. The same level of repression, if not greater repression, would be taking place against any violent protesters using Molotov cocktails and other assorted weapons, be they non-lethal, not guns exactly, but other type of weapons, throwing them at authorities, at the police, at government buildings, at public buses and places of gathering. I mean, that would never be tolerated in any democracy. So what's happening in Venezuela, I mean, I think that it's a very passionate issue for many of us who have been heavily involved in the country and the politics of Venezuela, right, and the social aspect of the country. But I think it's important, one of the main problems is that the only way you can get to a table and have a negotiation is if each side recognizes the legitimacy of each other and is open to hearing their voices. And what we're seeing at this stage is that has not happened. It has not happened from the opposition side. It has not happened entirely from the government side. Nicolas Maduro has opened the door, but he hasn't necessarily been willing to hear out all the perspectives that would come through that door. So
Okay.
I think that, Venezuela faces a very severe situation now, and in order to move forward, it's not about overthrowing a government, violent action in the streets, seeking external intervention, which would lead to nothing but grief and further crisis in the country, but rather finding a solution amongst all Venezuelans and taking a pause to actually listen to each other.
Okay. Maria, let's look at this another way. What do you believe Nicolas Maduro wants to ultimately achieve for Venezuela?
Well, I think his call for a constitutional assembly has been his last tool to try and achieve peace in the country. The opposition wanted a dialogue. He called for a dialogue. They said they would not sit for the dialogue unless they had the Vatican. They brought the Vatican, and again, it is not all the opposition, but the most violent part of the opposition, the most extremists, are the ones who have refused all these steps. So I hope that with a new constitutional assembly, that Venezuelans, as Eva Golinger had just said, will all come together and sit down and get the conditions for real peace in the country. And that includes ways in which people will not go to the streets or be allowed to carry out this terrible violence that has affected so many, and also to pave way what the president has said, which is quite unusual, said he hopes that the assembly will talk about post-oil Venezuela.
Right.
So there are 9 topics there. One of them is that, and one of them is climate change. These things are going to affect Venezuela very much.
The Constituent Assembly is a total delay tactic, I think.
So what I want to finish saying is, you asked me, because you asked me the question, I have the hope that with this new constitutional assembly, that the dialogue that didn't take place will take place, but in a broader sense.
Okay, Juan, is a constituent assembly the way out here?
It's a total delay tactic. Look, the talk about the opposition not wanting to enter into dialogue at this point, it's the resistance, in my assessment, is that the opposition has actually tried over the last couple of years to actually enter into real dialogue. They've exchanged proposals. Maduro has refused to recognize the legitimacy of the opposition. And now we're in a situation actually where President Maduro does not have legitimacy as a president. As a former official, it's not the perspective of the US government. Look at the Organization of American States. You have a Secretary General that was formerly with the Frente Amplio, a left-leaning party in Uruguay, that is questioning the legitimacy of a sitting president because of his inability to protect fundamental human rights, the freedom of assembly, and other rights that really are where leaders derive their legitimacy. Mexico. Other countries have actually stood up to say enough, because what this government has done is they're not interested in dialogue. They're interested only in staying in power, and unfortunately, the country and the people of the country are paying the price.
Okay, Juan, sorry, I called you Jose there.
It's okay.
Dany, we've got just a little time left, 20 seconds. Where is this all going?
I want to jump in and just say something, because the people are talking that the dialogue didn't work, and it's right, the dialogue didn't work, and both sides were in the dialogue. So you need two to tango, they say, right? So, but there's an important point to make that it's missing in the analysis of 2 of my colleagues here in the panel about the new constitution, and is that Maduro, with this idea, he's avoiding elections, and he's changing the electoral basis of the country. So now Venezuela is moving not to be a one-man, one-vote country like a democracy would be, but he wants to choose by hand half of the assembly with his people, and the other half maybe going to election, but he will have majority and he will stay in power forever.
Okay, Eva, you're hearing here that the president wants to avoid elections. It's a delaying tactic. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that it's a last chance effort at trying to salvage what support the government has left in the country, as well as, what this government has been trying to do all these years, a legacy that we're seeing in many ways coming unraveled. of the Bolivarian Revolution, due to many factors, both external and internal, including large responsibility on the part of the government. But I do believe that I cannot say whether or not I would agree that this is the right step to take, but it is a step being taken. I think that according to constitutional terms in Venezuela, this is not something that would simply be done and that's it. This is something that then would go to a referendum where people would vote on whether or not they want whatever this Constitutional Assembly comes up with or not, in the same way that the Constitution was voted on in the first place. I do believe the country needs to move towards elections of some sort according to the Constitution, not outside of the Constitution. I strongly believe that external interference is not the solution and will only cause more harm to Venezuela. And I also believe that violence is not the solution. So I hope that the country, that all sides can come to some sort of agreement on the best way to move forward. And I think at least this is an effort on the part of the government. I hope that other sides would put out other, suggestions that don't involve violent street protests that result in the deaths of more Venezuelans.